Well, well, well. Look what the cat dragged in. We got ourselves a video here, folks. It's been quite a while since I was able to do one of these. If you're watching on Patreon, you've stuck around for many, many months of absolutely no output from me. So bless you for that. What a patron you are. What a good soul. But here I am. It's the end of February. Um, I'm once again trying to kind of restart my engines, as it were, when it comes to this sort of political work. And in doing so, I feel like, you know, might as well dip my toe back in it, even if it's just for, just for the close homies on Patreon. You know what I mean? So I got my closest homie of all on the
Oh,
line here with me. Sukant Chandan is, as always, my guy, the guy I bring on to talk about whatever it is that needs to be talked about. Sukant is the coordinator of the Malcolm X movement based in London. He is a community activist, a longtime anti-colonial, anti-imperialist activist, anti-racist organizer, all around good guy. Sukant and I have known each other for years now, and we've been through quite a bit politically together in
oh,
strange ways through
yeah.
many trials and tribulations and trials by fire. But here we are, and trial by fire is probably a horrible phrase to have selected there, but here we are. I want to talk to you. Sukant, welcome back. I want to talk to you about Aaron Bushnell. So before we get into Aaron, welcome back, Sukant.
Thanks. It's what the Black Panther cat dragged back in, Eric,
Very good. Very nicely tied together. I like
and
that.
such very kind and generous words. And likewise, it's good to know you, Eric. And we have gone through our roller coaster of a journey, which continues, and some cringe moments, some good moments, and lots to reflect on. So thanks for coming back on the set.
Thank you. Let's hope that we're not about to make another cringe moment. I don't think we are, because I think we're going to talk about a very touching, heartfelt issue, but one that really, I think, touches on some of the most critical political questions that face, that face everybody, but especially that face people who call themselves leftists, Marxists, anti imperialists, anti colonialists, anti racists. These labels that we kind of attach to ourselves in order to signify our politics, I think sometimes need to be fleshed out a little bit. And sometimes they need to be fleshed out in the context of major events that happen. And what happened with Aaron Bushnell, I would argue, is a major, major event, maybe a watershed moment for activists on the left. Sakant, who is Aaron Bushnell? What happened?
Yeah, well, we're still getting to know Aaron Bushnell. In some senses, we've come to know him very intimately on some kind of dynamics of his action. But for the rest, we generally know quite little, and we're catching up. And especially on social media, people are kind of gathering information about him. And he comes across as he wasn't a grifter. He wasn't someone who put out videos like us. He wasn't someone who wrote to publish. He seemed to be a very humble, dedicated, sincere revolutionary comrade from an anarchist persuasion and in that camp. And he seemed to be on the grassroots in his community. All the kind of testimonials that's come through from people who knew him or worked with him, he was just a very humble person full of humility and no arrogance or bombasticness whatsoever. Ever. And I think that's reflected in his statement as he walked in his formal military fatigues, because he was a member of the US Armed Forces. As he walked to the gates of the Israeli embassy, he was very calm and disciplined. And even the way he spoke with great empathy and humanity and solidarity. I mean, there was a kind of, it was, if I can describe it, as an intense calmness that he had. He walked single-mindedly, made his statement, saying what I'm about to do is perhaps, it's a form of violence, but nothing like what the people of Gaza are going through. And he expressed his explicit solidarity, stood in front of the gates, doused himself with the inflammable liquid, and then he spends what seems, and obviously everything is longer than it seems when you're watching this because of the just, I suppose, the traumatic nature of it. It seemed that he was, and we've all been through this, those who have smoke, not the self-immolation, but trying to get the fire on the lighter. He's clicking around the bottom half of his body, trying to spark that little fire to then set himself alight. And he's struggling for what seems 20, 30 seconds. And he even gets irritated. I think he kind of audibly gets irritated by it. Then he's alight. As he's alight, I'm not sure if he has a fist up, because it's pixelated, that section of the video. And then he starts screaming, "Free Palestine," until the flames literally engulf him in agony. And he collapses in screaming agony. And then if it's a security or local police, seems like to be a black man who arrives with a fire extinguisher and is kind of, to finish off on this, it's kind of haunting me. And I don't give a fuck about the pigs, and security personnel guarding the Israeli embassy. But what he said is just kind of ringing out in my head. He said, "We don't need guns, we need fire extinguishers. We don't need guns, we need fire extinguishers." He was saying it to these white cops who turned up with guns loaded, pointed at Aaron Bushnell, on flames, literally on the floor, where this black colleague of theirs is dousing him with a fire extinguisher. Bring more fire extinguishers, not guns. And just the metaphor of that, it's deep, it's terribly moving, terribly moving.
So for Americans, I think in particular, but certainly not only Americans, maybe the indelible image before Aaron Bushnell of self-immolation as the monks protesting against the invasion of Vietnam and the American destruction of Vietnam. I wonder if you have any comments on the symbolic nature of this protest, what it has meant, this kind of protest has meant historically, and why now, why this guy, why Gaza?
Yeah, no, thanks. These are big subjects, big conversations. So let's see what we can get through. Thanks, Eric. Of course, there was someone else who died in a self-immolation in the USA, also in solidarity with Gaza, as far as I can understand, on December the 3rd. And I have to research that incident. And also recently, there was a comrade in DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, who was protesting the neocolonial war of destabilization and looting, especially in the Kivu region, also an act of self-immolation against the Congolese genocide. And of course, it's been important, and it's been a positive development in the context of so many frustrations and failures, that people are more tying together anti-colonial frameworks to unite Sudan, Congo, Haiti, Gaza, etc. So back to Aaron Bushnell and his act of sacrifice is in the context of nearly 6 months of a global colonial genocide that's been in many ways subcontracted and also led in part by the colonial settler Israeli state, focused on Gaza, but nearly over 400 people in the West Bank also have been killed by the Israeli occupation since October the 7th. Now, we've all been shocked by the response, the colonial genocidal response of October the 7th. I think even seasoned people like us, it's intense, and those who were active in an anti-imperialist way post 9/11, in around 9/11, we've kind of been through a similar experience. Because I'm not saying they're the same, they're not, but there's some similarities between 9/11 and October the 7th. The similarity is a big act of violence targeting colonial symbols and targets. It shocked the Western colonial global order. And similarly to 9/11, the colonialists have to be seen to be then delivering a great act of punishment and retribution post the anti-colonial grand violent act, to send a message to the world. And that was shock and awe. It was explicit at the time, if you remember, a quote unquote shock and awe, full spectrum dominance, to tell the oppressed, don't you dare think you can stand up against us, because this is what you're going to get. And that's what they delivered. Now, in that context, then it throws up those in the world who want to stand with humanity in this situation of resistance to colonialism. It throws up our challenges. And again, those of us who are active in the anti-war movement and around Iraq will know, again, we're going through this again. How are we to be effective in this scenario, right? And now we're kind of depressingly meeting up with great frustration and sadness week upon week. The conversations are ever present. How can we be more effective? How can we be more effective? But in those conversations, and to finish up on this, because I want it to be a back and forth between us, I think we have collectively held back. And that's where Aaron Bushnell was like, no, I'm not going to hold back. Aaron Bushnell did what he did, as I interpret in part, as an indirect critique to say what we've done collectively is not enough, is nowhere near enough how we should be enacting our humanity as resistance. And here you go. And what a powerful act. I mean, the fact that he was in those fatigues, like as I said in a commentary earlier today, he literally burned to the ground his own colonial internalization of being a partial participant in the violent colonial order as a member of the US Armed Forces. But he said publicly and in the greatest sacrifice, no, I'm not going to stand for that. I'm going to burn that to the ground. It's fucking deep. But go on, Eric.
I couldn't agree more. I think that there's probably a number of issues that probably should be addressed. I think you know much more about it than I do, just because I've been a little bit out of it, out of the news cycle, and I didn't research it deeply. But anarchism as a political ideology,
Yeah, go on,
I
man. Go
mean,
on.
you could take it in many different directions, and I'm certainly not going to comment on, most modern day anarchist politics, because I'm not sure that that's really what we're talking about here. But anarchism, as its historic sort of framework, to a large degree, is rooted on Bakunin's idea of propaganda by deed, right? The idea that the anarchist is the one who must shoot the gun to assassinate the person, to set the events in motion, to then bring about the fall of structures. And the first thing that struck me about all of this, and when I heard that Aaron Bushnell was of, I don't know, you could maybe speak more to this, what specifically his anarchist politics were, where he was involved, etc. But just from a very broad level, an anarchist exercising true propaganda by deed, the most intense deed of all, really.
Yeah, I mean, but it crosses over into radical other socialist anti-colonial ideologies as well. That every direct action is a propaganda action. That's kind of embedded in my being since I was a teenager, in studying Mao, protracted people's war, and other revolutionary movements are armed and direct actions. Absolutely. I mean, and that's why I say to my comrades all the time: everything we do is to educate, inspire, motivate, organize further in our direct actions. We're not doing it for the sake of doing it. Although, of course, in so doing as well, you want to degrade and target the symbols and actualities of the colonial enemy. And this is interesting to explore. There's so many layers here to explore. Now, let me start here. I think whiteness and countering whiteness, as represented by Aaron Bushnell's action, is central to all of this. I think this is the central kind of thread in all of it. So to anarchism, as we know, and as we know very well, there's white anarchism and there's counter-white anarchism. And Aaron Bushnell is very much in the frame of counter-white anarchism. White anarchism can be quite Eurocentric, and definitely in the British context, that whole white anarchist community has crumbled to a negligible state. It's not really active and in capacity like it was a decade or more ago. Now, also, a lot of white anarchist spaces are exactly that. They're white anarchist spaces, and you're like, do non-white people not exist? In this flipping town, an area in which you operate or that you have your squat. So I think Aaron Bushnell is smashing that whole internalized white framework within a radical left thing, in this case, anarchism. And you have similar problems with Eurocentricity amongst other socialists, black nationalists, Pan-Africanists, so-called, etc. But in this regards, Aaron is saying, no, I'm not content just sitting on my anarchist laurels, as it were, in a Eurocentric framework. I'm going to smash that in the most graphic, profound manner that I can. And here you go. I'm standing with the human animals, quote unquote. I am standing in that Fanonian kind of analysis with the people who have been forced into the zone of non-being. I'm going to enter the zone of non-being with them and look at the response of the quote unquote human animals, the revolutionaries in Gaza, all the revolutionary factions, some of which I can't mention positively because they're on the fucking prescribed list of terrorist organizations now in this state. But the PFLP is not one of those prescribed organizations. And all of them have given so much honor and admiration and respect to Aaron Bushnell and his act of solidarity. And I think that indicates what the revolutionaries in Palestine, and if anyone knows the Palestinian street, quote unquote, they will know. And if you don't know, you better get to know that the Palestinian people want us to go in that direction of radicalization that Aaron Bushnell is in. They don't necessarily want us to do the same thing that he did, but they haven't positively commented on any real individual of a Westerner in this whole genocide since October the 7th, except Aaron Bushnell now. And that's significant because I think in so doing, they're saying, come on, guys, radicalize yourselves. We've been asking you to besiege imperialist interests since October the 7th. We've been asking you to besiege the Israeli embassies and et cetera, et cetera. I don't think they've been satisfied with us, and we can hear that nearly daily from the voices in Gaza itself. Stop taking pictures. We're sick and tired of speeches. Where the hell is the world? Why are you leaving us alone in this? So Aaron Bushnell's act points exactly in the direction we should be traveling, and we should have been traveling in. Now, 1968, when I said to the leading original Black Panther Party leaders after George Floyd's police racist killing, and then the uprising, 2 weeks uprising after that, I said, is this like comparable to the late 60s? They laughed, actually. With all due respect to the uprising in 2020, they said, no, it's nothing comparable. Open any newspaper in 1968 and you'll see what was going on. Now, I raised that to say that basically a form of semi and actual guerrilla warfare was kicking off disproportionately in Black working class communities across the USA in the late 60s. These were like military it was a military campaign. And it took that level and that to be organized around the Black Panther Party. And as you know, Huey Newton offered volunteers to the Vietnamese resistance. He said, I'll give you members to fight the US Army. I mean, incredible gesture. It was that level to which then we and all the other non-violent direct actions, this whole mass movement of a whole plethora and diversity of tactics, violent and non-violent, etc. I think you have to go to that extent to enact a real internationalism to be anywhere near, whereas the imperialist ruling classes then think, is this really worth going ahead with from here on in? That in so doing, we're pushing this imperialist war. It's bringing the war home. And so, I mean, it'd be interesting to hear what you have to say, but I think it's that level that we need to reach to before we can start enacting any kind of real direct disruption and internationalist unity with people like the Palestinians going forward. It's interesting what our friend Yoav Litvin said actually to me the other day in this regard. We were reflecting, and we've been reflecting frequently in this last 5 months. And we both agreed that actually history will see this as an age of innocence, in that we haven't really even started to experience and witness what's about to be imposed on the oppressed people of the world. And the actions of collective imperialism with Israel in Gaza this last 5 months is an indication of what we're all in for. And that again raises even more the importance of us recognizing the challenges before us and trying to meet them.
Couldn't agree more. Of course, this is something you and I have been talking about for years now, that the period that we're living through, that we will look back on this period as a really almost sort of the calm before the storm, a period that we look back on fondly because of how bad things ultimately got. And I think that ever more so every day that passes as we head, careening towards a election in the United States that's, boy, every election seems like the worst of my lifetime, but this really is going to truly be the worst. And it has such wide-reaching global implications. Now, I want to ask a somewhat cynical question, I guess, maybe.
Yeah, I was waiting for this. Come on.
What's the fucking point, Sukant? Aaron walks up and does this extraordinarily courageous act. Aaron Bushnell, you know better. Of course, you know more about him than I do. But my guess would be that somebody like him with this level of conviction is probably not totally naive about the actual impact that it would make in the society that he lived in, right? Knowing that the news cycle doesn't care, that the news cycle doesn't stop, that this would be a disposable story like every other story that came before it and every story that's going to come after it, because that is the nature of this culture and this society that is alienated and unfeeling and broken in every possible way, psychologically and emotionally. So the question is, what's the point? Why? Why do it? Why go through with it? I can understand that he may have, and I don't know the circumstances, maybe he had suicidal ideation for years leading up to this, and this was just his opportunity to do the thing that he'd been thinking about for a long time, but to do it with a statement, right? Maybe it was as simple as that, or maybe it was something even far deeper than that, and more significant than that. So, but the question remains, what is the ultimate point of something like this? What do you think?
Yeah, I think we need to explore this thoroughly, and obviously we can have some exchanges here, but it requires a lot of thought, and it's a lifelong process. We reflect on these things because there's not necessarily any definitive and conclusive answers to this, because things are complex in social and political relations. Anyway, so let me try and make some comments. Okay, so first of all, there's been a big negative reaction from the left. Okay, so social
Of
media.
course. Of course there was.
Yeah, quite. I can feel your political kind of commentaries there in the through the silence. But yeah, of course, in the world of the Twitter sphere, everyone wants to be a fucking oppositional cunt, don't they? And you know,
Everyone's got to be spicy. No one's got to have any meat.
we got to pile on, we got to drag, we got to be more radical than the radical. We got to be more radical than Aaron Bushnell. Aaron
This is
Bushnell's not
why.
the radical.
Yeah, well,
I'm
he's
the
a white.
radical.
He's a privileged white man. Come on.
Don't use rest in power. Anyway,
Yeah. Oh
mate,
fuck yeah! I saw that.
mate, bonkers. Anyway, so but let's try to be serious to kind of look at the deeper issues at play here. I call it's a reaction of colonial narcissism and individualism that is triggered by also a deep internalized guilt complex in that I can never be a human being like that. And how dare you enact a humanity so radically that then, in so doing, sets me off balance and triggers my own internalized fears and insecurities and anxieties, instead of me just taking ownership of that and saying, because I'm happy to fucking say it, Eric, I'm too scared to do what Aaron bloody did. Yeah. I wish I could do that. I can't do that because I'm a coward. Yeah. Relatively. I can say that and I'm honest about that. And I have no shame in my shame in saying that. Right. But other people aren't. They don't act in good faith. They're not honest. They're not sincere. And everyone wants a scapegoat whenever they feel that they're feeling a bit insecure. So Aaron's the problem. Yeah. And that fucking piece of shit sitting on Twitter talking crap is the savior and is our leader relatively. I mean, come on, this is madness. But there's a lot of, colonial internalized guilt, shame, blame, self-loathing, questioning, self-crises that's happening on a mass level. And it's being distorted because we have no bloody leadership. We have no leadership. And Aaron Bushnell has become the leadership, actually, not in an organized way, but in a symbolic way, as a pole of attraction and leadership, an example. He's saying, look, this is an example of what you can do to be more impactful. So all of that's going on, right? So we need to be clear about negative reactions. And doesn't it happen in any group? Me and you could set up a group, Eric, right? Let's assume you and I set up a little sect and we think we're the bloody vanguard, right? And you get arrested, right, in a direct action. And I'm like, oh shit, I thought this was a reading group, that we'd read Marx together in this little sect and posture as the vanguard. Eric's got arrested. I start to get shit scared. And instead of saying to Eric, look, I'm shit scared, I'm out of this, I didn't realize it was to do with real struggle, which has its real consequences, right? Instead of saying that, oh, Eric, you dragged me into this. It's all your fault. Why did you do that like that? It's all your fault. Finger point, finger point, finger point. It happens in every group. It's happened in my political life again and again and again. And it's happening now writ large, but they can go to hell. The fact is, Again, the Palestinian revolutionaries are helping to give leadership, as they always have. They said, no, this guy's a good man. He was a good man. He did the right thing. So, okay, to go to, well, what's the point of it? Well, first of all, in a context of no leaders, really, of a leaderless, whole chaotic situation in the solidarity movement, in the absence of any real functional radical organizations, in that context, for Aaron to say, well, you know what, I've got to do what I've got to do. I've got to do this act. On just that level, it's super important. And other people have referenced this, and I think they're correct. In his martyrdom, and this is the thing about martyrdom, and I think you implied this just in your comments before what I'm saying. If he had lived, no one would have known about him. Actually, he did his act a few days ago, and I was even with a few anarchist comrades in Oxford, and he hadn't died at that point, and we only talked to him for about 60 seconds, and we moved on. The fact that he's lost his life has meant everyone is engaged, and that is the role of martyrdom. I'm not saying you go kill yourself, everyone is going to know you. I'm not saying it in that silly way, but martyrdom. Sometimes death plays more of a political, active, and effective role than living does. So I think that speaks to the moment in which Malcolm X was martyred, the moment in which Shahid Bhagat Singh was martyred at the age of 23, the moment Che Guevara was martyred on the mountain in Bolivia. Through their death, they became more powerful than they arguably would have been through the living. And this framework is in a lot of people's cultures. It's most known through what's known as religious frameworks, right? So obviously one of the most famous martyrdoms that we know about is Jesus Christ. And, Christians know this. He gave, whatever they say, he gave his life so we could do whatever, right? So martyrdom does exist. Like I said, I'm not trying to universalize and saying, look, martyrdom is always like that. But I think this, in the context of Aaron Bushnell, it does show that he sparked a more focused and distilled political conversation around ethics and morality and action than anyone else has done in the previous 5 months. So that's an important contribution, and there's other levels that we can talk about.
Oh, I agree. I agree with you. I know that we said we were going to limit our time today, so I just want to. You mentioned something about leadership, and I think this is an important question to ask. So, I'll just ask it very simply. How can you say that there's no leadership when we have Iran and Russia and China? We have the glorious beacons of the axis of resistance. These last few months, they have shown themselves to be the true leaders of the opposition to imperialism, aren't they? Come on, Scott.
So yeah, it's total. Again, I think it's important. Those people who are not like somehow bought into either in a sectarian, religious or political or financial manner into that camp can see that when the Iranian Islamic Republic is so-called, is faced with a genocide of a people that it uses more than any other people in the world to legitimize itself, that it will stand back. Everyone knows that now. The Palestinians know that. Everyone knows that. So that, we didn't need this to happen to know they're like that, but that's not insignificant. And then, of course, Ansar Allah, Houthis in Yemen have tried to intervene in whichever capacity that they have. It's not useful, but it's limited. Same as Lebanese Hezbollah. And then we can argue, well, we don't want Yemen to be flattened. We don't want Lebanon to be flattened. But see, as we go forward, all of these things we've talked about and more indicate a relative crumbling of any notions of what bloody anti-colonial global unity even means, right? Those old things in which, Malcolm X, Wadi Haddad, Frantz Fanon, and many others stood on, and they were actually informing some semblances of an international alliance of struggle. That whole culture just fades and fades and fades into the background, and then what is increasingly attempted to be naturalized in the foreground and in the contemporary world as we go forward is trying to naturalize notions of we should be divided on principle. We should not stand together on principle. We should be narrow nationalists and sectarian on principle. And that somehow is a more sensible and rational and radical positioning than the radical position itself, right?
One of the, just One of the features of this issue that I think is too often overlooked, and I don't mean to reduce this to the most simple one-line soundbite, but there is value in that. Iran and Russia and China and all of these other countries, these are capitalists.
Yeah, it's very
They
important.
are run
Right wing,
by
right wing.
capitalists, right wing, in to a large degree neoliberal in the Western
Absolutely,
terminology, capitalists, whether they are Iranian, whether they are Russian, and even to a degree, though it's more complicated, Chinese as well.
absolutely.
Right. And so, what we see being demonstrated, and what you just pointed out, when you say the collapse of even any semblance of anti-colonial unity, that's because there cannot be, by definition,
Mm.
anti-colonial unity that includes those classes, that includes those people that are literally in charge of these countries. So it undermines the very notion of a quote unquote axis of resistance, or a quote unquote, anti-colonial solidarity movement, or anything like that. The only such thing that would be worthy of that name is an actual movement involving the actually existing working people of these countries. Right. But of course, that's not what the red brown types, the axis of resistance types, the
That's right.
glory to Tehran and Hezbollah types, or whatever. That's not what they say, because it's in their financial interests to keep pushing the idea that these countries, along with their leaderships, are actually engaged in resistance, which, as we've seen since October 7th, is simply not true.
Yeah, I concur with all of that. So October the 7th opens up a opportunity to recalibrate the world order in attempted direction of the benefit of the oppressed of the world. That's what October the 7th opens up, right? It's an extraordinary moment. I'm saying that to say then China, Iran, and Russia then have the option of a few things, even posturing things that could be more effective. They've all chosen not to do anything. So the Chinese have the audacity and the arrogance to go to the ICJ hearing a few days ago with their official spokesperson to wax lyrical during a genocide of the Palestinians, to say that they support, that they reiterate the international legal right of the Palestinian people to armed self-defense, while all the while still having deep military relations with the Israeli state itself and refusing to even attempt to arm the Palestinians in Gaza. It's just the level of disrespect and insult. I mean, it's so high. I mean, I had a few comrades send.
Sukant, I want to put the brakes just a second, and I'm not trying to disagree because I agree with you,
Yeah,
but
I think I know what you're going to say.
the Israelis themselves would watch a statement like that and laugh. And the
Other,
reason they would laugh is because they know, just as well as the Chinese leadership and the Chinese representative knows, this is all for show.
that's right.
This is just politics. This is the politics of media and sound bites and domestic audiences and international propaganda and whatever else you want to call it. The Israelis understand it just as well as the Russians, just as well as the Americans, just as well as the Chinese do. So it's quite literally meaningless, those
Yeah,
kinds of statements.
yeah, I agree. And so I think the ICJ itself is Neocolonial Theatre as well. So it's just a fucking place of theatre for everyone to do theatrics, from the ANC to everyone else. And this is where Aaron Bushnell's action is again important. So after the protest movement has become demoralized, fatigued, confused, divided, second guessing itself constantly for 5 months, then the ICJ is raised by the South Africans, like the South Africans helped anyone in recent bloody years, failed the Libyans in the NATO war. I mean, they're the great example of total sellouts to the cause of the global South peoples, not least the South African masses themselves, who are going through all kinds of chaos and crises in the failures of the ANC state. But that aside, so the ANC go to the ICJ. The ICJ then becomes like, people are promoting it as like a savior to the Palestinians, which is a total joke, right? And so then it has a relative impact on the protest movement to say, well, it has an influence to say the direct actions aren't so important. Let's go towards these more legalistic global frameworks. like that bloody delivered anything to the South African people after the formal overthrow of the apartheid regime, right? These whole frameworks fail our people. The Good Friday Agreement in Britain, the destruction of the Basque militant movement in occupied Basque in France and Spain, and so on and so forth. This whole colonial peace process racket that's been going on since the 90s, the disarmament of revolutionary peasant armies in Colombia in a similar framework, etc. So what Aaron Bushnell then does by his action as a contribution to this whole conversation is to say, no, we return back to the radical direct action as the path to solidarity, not the neo-colonial frameworks, right? And that's my interpretation, and that's what I would like to kind of amplify in his action, to say, look, people, this is the course, this is the political aesthetic in terms of its militancy and sacrifice, not in the same way, but the spirit of sacrifice, the spirit of courageousness and standing in direct solidarity is what we need to grow as our political identity, rather than thinking the ICJ can save us, or or Macron's posturing can help us, or the Qataris are the saviors, or Erdogan is the saviors of the Palestinians, etc., etc.
I know we're talking about Aaron Bushnell, and I don't want to cut short any discussion of him and what he's done, because it is heroic is probably not a strong enough word, I would say, to describe what he's done. However, in the interest of time, I do want to touch on one last point with you, and we'll probably be fleshing this out further as we get back to recording more often and having these conversations more regularly. But Sukant, I think that we would be remiss if we didn't point out the fact that, as horrible as the situation is with Gaza right now, with the international situation and everything else, I think we also need to be mindful that, as you alluded to earlier, we may very well quite soon look back at this period as a better period because of what might be coming. And I mean that in various ways. And the obvious one that I mean, of course, is the return of Trump. And presumably, if Trump were to be elected again, I obviously don't know that to be certain, though if I had to put money on it, I would bet that he will be. If Trump were to return again, that would now infuse this entire conversation with a new level of barbarism, a new level of genocidal behavior, and really, I would say, a permanent fascist turn, one that might potentially be irreversible. And I don't mean that in the way that fucking Paul Krugman and liberals talk about the end of democracy with Trump. I mean that in the sense that the actual structures of power, the institutions themselves, will be so stocked with fascists that they will never be rid of them, right? It will be a permanent political change. And I do think that will have significant repercussions in the so-called Middle East, and especially in Gaza, as even the minimal, and I don't want to call it restraints because that overstates what the United States has done, but even the minimal caution that the Biden administration has shown politically in terms of world opinion and so forth, that will be gone. We will enter into a new phase of this, one where Israeli tactics against Gaza will not only be justified and supported by the United States, they will be further imported into the United States. The rounding up, the exterminationist politics, the exterminationist language, that will come back to the United States, just as the war on terror tactics came back to the United States. It will be a new era of U.S. domestic fascism that will then, of course, be coupled with a more viciously imperialist policy from the United States. And this is what I think we should expect. So I don't know. I guess I don't have a question so much as I want to get your comments on A, not falling into the trap of thinking that because Trump is coming, the status quo has to be preserved, because that's obviously liberal Democrat thinking. But B, also recognizing, I guess somewhat paradoxically, how bad things are going to get.
Yeah, I think reading George Jackson is really important in this regards. Not only his analysis of fascism at his particular time, and the way that he analyzed US internal fascism with its colonial genocidal wars globally, not least Vietnam, That's really important. And then to apply some of that framework to us. I mean, listen, we're living through, I don't know what section of the long period of the victories of the right globally, which actually, I mean, another comrade of mine who I greatly respect, younger Irish Republican, he always argues, like, Sukant, what you see as the best moment of the Third World Liberation movements was actually a short moment, and it was already compromised even as it looked like at its peak. Um, but let's say the late 60s into the early 70s was the peak. The right has been seeing victories actually since the mid 70s, arguably in a lot of ways, perhaps even the early 70s. And we had a moment around the 60s where things were pushing forward quite well. So we're living through a very long period of the increasing victories of the right. And those victories just increase month upon year, month upon month, year upon year. So Trump quite neatly fits into that, and we have our own form of that in Britain with Brexit, and now the far right governing Tory party, and similar culture wars and political crises. So Trump is if he returns, then of course it's to do. We have to understand how it fits into the global capitalist situation and crises, and its attempts to try and continue increasing its super profits to the global rich. So that's why to understand Gaza is so important for the global working classes and their struggle, but also the situation in Khartoum and Sudan, also the ongoing situation in DRC. These are all indications that capitalist looting will have no truck with opposition on any level. That you dare to try and counter oppose our increasing monopoly of power and extractive capitalist economic relationship, this is what you're going to get. So you're right. Every time they have a colonial war, it always, I mean, in a ruling class fashion, we say it, bring the war home, but they bring the war home all the time. And there's this constant cross-fertilization that the West constituted the Israeli project, and then the Israeli project is a subcontractor of the West in terms of colonial terror. And through the practice of colonial terror conducted by the Israeli state and its senior partners in the West, they return those tactics and they globe. So you see the Indian police, I'm looking at the Indian police against the Punjabi farmers at the moment in the way that they're policing. I'm thinking, that reminds me of someone. It reminds me of West Bank and Jerusalem. And I'm seeing this globalized, the action in Sri Lanka. I mean, China, Russia, Israel, the West, Indian BJP government. I mean, it's like one fused kind of consensus of capitalist culture and practice. And as we go forward, as the system goes into more crisis of the basic contradiction between the rich get richer and the poorer get poorer, of course they're going to bring in people like Trump and people like him to do what they need to do to ensure that they have the next yacht and the next thing that they want, and next thing. This is just the rationale of the economic order. Where we have an absence socially is we're not the 1920s. We have no, that was a period in history, even relative to now, where I think things were healthier politically globally.
It's a really, Sakan, I got to tell you, it's a really brilliant thing you just said. I'm not sure that I had ever really conceptualized it in this way, but here, let me throw this out to you. The right has essentially been winning and consolidating its power more or less since about, as you say, I mean, it depends on how you look at it, but maybe 1968 or 1971, the triumph of neoliberal economics, Milton Friedman in the Chicago School exporting it to Chile and all throughout Latin America and all of that. That's kind of the first phase of this. Ronald Reagan consolidating power in the United States, exporting that, all that whole period, the late 60s into the 70s, and really all the way up until today, I think you're right, is really an sort of an unbroken or mostly unbroken string of decades whereby the right has reconstituted itself globally after, I think one could argue, maybe 150 to 200 years of the left, quote unquote, marching in Europe from the Enlightenment to the socialism and Marx and the rise of the working class and the consolidation of republics and nation states against the kings, against the monarchs, against the ruling order that had been in power for 1,000 years, right? That there was a march of quote unquote modernity. Socialism was on the march. The workers were on the march decade after decade, and power was constantly, the ruling class was conceding left and right to that power, growing labor protections, labor laws, child labor, what the 5-day work week, unions, whatever. You could point to 1,000 examples where this sentiment continually triumphed over and over and over again. And I think you're absolutely correct. That period was maybe a glorious period of human history, and that period might very well be over, as we have the distinct displeasure of living through the early stages of the right wing sort of reaction to that 150, 200-year period. What do you think of that?
I think there's a lot. I think that makes sense. I think we need to reflect and meditate and research more into what we're saying here, because this is a very important. The funny thing is, thanks for sharing all of that. I need to think about that and incorporate that into my analysis. I actually mark the beginning of the historic period of the victories of the right, when Mao secretly invites Kissinger to Beijing in 1971. He refuses to meet Huey Newton's delegation, leading the Black Panther Party delegation to Beijing, because he wants to meet Nixon in 1972. I point that as the beginning of the end, because Mao did personify the most radical personification of the global struggle. And then the way he united with Robert F. Williams in 1963, and then the Black Panther Party, if that was deepened and pushed forward, we could have something interesting there. We didn't. It all unraveled very quickly, and there's lots of other unravelings that went on at a very similar time. I think you're right. But listen, I mean, there's been enough fictional writings, and there's enough concrete facts to also point to the growing technological sophistication of violent repression and oppression around the world in using social media and new technologies as well. I raise that to say, we've got this closing, and it's on a never-ending closing window of relative space to push back. We're going to be faced with it's already happening around border regimes, colonial border regime management. It's happening around policing protests of people. China is a world leader in terms of this hyper management through use of technology to assure its control of society, basically, and human beings. So, we're in an emergency situation, and I've been ringing this stupid bloody alarm bell that no one wants to hear for a good part of a couple of decades. But that's quite the point. We're in such a demoralized political state, and we've become bloody slaves to this thing, right? I mean, we have enslaved ourselves voluntarily into which we become the commodity. It's an incredible, and then we're addicted on this. And we check it every few minutes, and we partake into that technological enslavement that facilitates the system on all levels, not including child labor in mines in Congo, which people have correctly raised as well, in using all of this infrastructure, technological infrastructure that we're using. So we can't stop ringing the alarm, the alarm in this regards, because my fear is the old kind of classical scientific understanding of repression, exploitation, and resistance, that, the capitalists can't make money without socializing the proletariat more and exploiting them. And the more they're exploiting them, the more the proletariat has to respond. Well, that's not necessarily the case as we've seen it around the world. And it's not necessarily, and I've been thinking about this for well over a decade, as it starts to dawn upon us after our youthful, delusional enthusiasms, that it's not working out as we thought it would, and the world is crashing into more reaction. So yeah, but the resistance in Gaza is also the light, or as they say in Arabic, the al-manar. It's the beacon. It's the example. In its political culture, the people of Gaza are the most organized and revolutionary people of any people in the world. A little colonial ghetto of 2.3 million people has defined humanity, not only in this period, but for a longer period of time. And so the example is in front of us. So what's stopping? The questions are, I suppose, what's stopping us from being here, seeing that, and not trying to meet those challenges? What's stopping us exactly? And I come back to Aaron Bushnell and Aaron Bushnell's example, and that the way that triggers in us, in me as well, anxieties about my own internalized colonial cowardice when confronted with what I should be confronting. And I try to do that the best I can, even despite my cowardice and the tension between cowardice and courageousness. But that is the final question in terms of what are we, or are we not? I mean, I've been discussing this with you. It's like, look in the mirror. Who are we? In an age of total political confusion and collapse and toxicities, go back to the mirror. Who am I? What do I stand for? What do I believe in? And can I act that out in a human way? And not acting that out, what's the consequences, not only on the global oppressed, but my own sense of being, my own sense of belonging, my own sense of self-worth in all of these contexts? Sorry to go a bit philosophical there.
No, beautifully said. Very poetically tied together there, Sukant. We will leave it there.
Nice one.
I'm going to try to get Sukant every week or two, maybe, hopefully, maybe more, maybe less. I don't know, but regularly, so that we can chat again and we can have this available for people to enjoy or hate or somewhere in between. But anyway, Sukant Chandan, Malcolm X Movement. Follow Malcolm X Movement on Twitter or X or whatever it's called now, and supports Kant's work. Kant is my guy. Thanks, Kant.
Likewise, good to be here. Long live Aaron Bushnell. Long live all our martyrs in Palestine and in the struggle against colonialism. And respect to you, Eric. Thanks for the chat. Look forward to the next time. Thanks, listeners. All the best.